With us now is Gloria La Riva. Thank you for being with us, Gloria. Start us off with why you decided to run as a candidate for the PSL.
The elections traditionally in the United States have been solely a race between the Democrats and the Republicans, two parties which hold up the system of capitalism and also have both promoted the wars, sanctions, occupations that we are seeing even today. And I think that the Super Tuesday phenomenon of the other Democratic Party candidates dropping out soon after the South Carolina primary in order to back Joe Biden, despite the enormous popularity of Bernie Sanders and what he represents, a distinct change from the Democrat and Republican status quo. What Bernie Sanders is calling for is an economic program to alleviate the suffering of tens of millions of people in the US. And the Democrats weren't going to have any part of that because they're backed by the same interests that back the Republican Party. So the Party for Socialism and Liberation that I'm the candidate for, and also for peace and freedom that I'm vying for in California, we believe that the message of socialism, of the need to struggle against the banks, the corporations, against the Pentagon, and anti people policies is more necessary than ever. You know, we don't know what's going to end up with the Democratic nomination, but it looks more and more like Joe Biden is going to win the nomination. And I think our message of socialism, of struggle, of the people mobilizing for people's rights, for an end to war, for peace, and for economic justice is going to ring truer than ever. We will be applying to get on the ballot in quite a number of states in the United States. Even though it's a very hard process, you have to gather tens of thousands of signatures, but we have many volunteers, many members ready to do that.
I think it's significant that your vice presidential pick is Leonard Peltier. Why did you make that decision?
Leonard Peltier is a Native American leader from originally the American Indian movement. He has been in prison for 44 years, a result of the persecution of the FBI and the US government. Really, Leonard is a continued victim of the US wars against Native people, the genocide that intensified in the mid 1880s, the mid 1800s actually, and which stole virtually all of Native land in the United States. Leonard is innocent of the charge. He was falsely convicted in 1976, and we asked him to be our candidate as vice president for the elections in 2020, partly in order to raise the issue of Native sovereignty, of the extreme poverty that most Native people suffer, especially on the reservations, and also to help his freedom cause. He is well known around the world, but is not as well known in the United States, where he is imprisoned. So we have the honor of having him as our vice presidential candidate. When we asked him to join our campaign, he wrote back and said, "Not only am I a Native traditionalist, but I am a socialist."
Right now, the COVID-19 is the biggest news headline worldwide. Countries like Italy are absolutely struggling to act quickly to contain the spread, and sanctions on countries like Iran may render devastating effects for their ability to provide necessary medical services. Back in the US, what's socialism got to do with an outbreak like this?
First of all, about the COVID-19 illness that is spreading around the world, it's important to take lessons from China and what they did. Despite the vilification in the US media and by certain US officials, China has basically arrested the spread in Wuhan and further in the country. Even though there's been many illnesses, the fact that they took a centralized, very aggressive approach shows the way for the other countries. The building of 3 hospitals within days is amazing. And the United States has that capacity. The US has enormous productive capacity and huge amounts of wealth, but it's not going to help the people. The United States has no guaranteed sick leave for workers, has no guaranteed vacation rights for workers. Many people don't even have vacation. And so now, at a time when people have to be isolated, in quarantine, they're suffering an enormous loss of wages. Most people in this country live barely paycheck to paycheck, and the loss of one paycheck can mean homelessness, can mean destitution. So, the Party for Socialism and Liberation in our campaign is demanding, first of all, eminent domain to take over all the empty properties that could house the roughly 500,000 homeless people who stand to suffer the greatest by being unprotected by the elements, not having proper food. We demand that instead of what's taking place today, where the top bankers of Goldman Sachs, of Chase Manhattan, and other banks, the executives are going to meet with Trump today, and undoubtedly they will be asking for another hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout, some backing from the federal government. In fact, their crisis is something that has been developing since the last crisis of 2008, and that is their speculative practices and price gouging, profit gouging. We demand that the people have to come first. Our call is for an emergency order for sick leave to be granted to all workers, that there be financing required in order to back the low wages of many, many workers. Even now, there's a call for raising the minimum wage, many, many other programs to provide all the resources necessary for the hospitals and clinics, and to allow everybody in this country to get health care regardless of ability to pay. As you know, probably 50 million people do not have health care or proper health care.
And now, one of the places where people aren't receiving proper medical care is in the cages and camps where both U.S. citizens and immigrants are incarcerated en masse. What does your party propose in this regard?
Just a few months ago, the U.S. government in the federal detention center of the people who are being held by ICE, they refused a demand by doctors and other people in immigrant rights to vaccinate people for the flu. There is a flu vaccine, and yet the government has refused to vaccinate people in these detentions, in the jails, where sadly children and adults are being held separated from their loved ones. Also, in the federal prison, actually, I spoke with Leonard Peltier last night, our vice presidential candidate. He is in the federal prison in Florida, and he and the other inmates in the prison are not getting proper care, even for their certain and current health problems today. He needs medical care and he is not receiving it. So he said, if we're hit by the, as he called it, coronavirus, we're going to be in very great danger. And that's one of our demands, is that prisoners, whether state, local, or federal, and all those who are in ICE, of course, we demand their freedom immediately, but all those people being held in detention must be given prime care as the illness hits, and preventive care, the proper kind of housing for the inmates, the proper nutrition. Many of them are not fed enough, and to stop treating them in where they, in detention, are not allowed to get the care that they need.
More and more young people are turning to candidates who they see reflect more conscious proposals on U.S. foreign policy, particularly as we see continued unilateral coercive measures or deadly sanctions, these crimes against humanity and war crimes against Iran, the DPRK, Venezuela, and Cuba, and other countries. Can you elaborate a bit on your criticisms of Washington's foreign policies and what you propose?
Well, we are calling for an immediate end to the U.S. blockade of Cuba, the sanctions, and really the blockade against Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, all the some 70 countries that the U.S. is blockading, primarily Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, and North Korea, and Iran. They must be lifted immediately because they need desperately, as all countries, the right to medical access to the medicines that are needed that they can't provide in the country. And also, Cuba, for example, has much that they can offer in terms of medical care. They have the interferon that they're producing en masse and is being used by China, for example. People of the US and the world could benefit. This crisis of the COVID-19 requires an international cooperation. And the blockade, which is harming the Cuban and Venezuelan people, is creating unnecessary suffering and even deaths. Food is being blocked from Venezuela. Cuba is being denied the oil that they have a right to from Venezuela in exchange for their cooperation with Venezuela in terms of teachers and doctors. This is a crime against humanity. The greatest violator of human rights is the United States government, and it's being heightened by this illness of COVID-19. So I think that the youth of the United States are definitely the ones who come out in the streets against war. We saw thousands of people just in January, on January 4th and 25th, against the danger of a war against Iran. And this is the hope that we have. I think that's why many of them are supporting Bernie Sanders. Tonight is the primary, and hopefully he will be able to have a strong showing, because even though I'm a candidate for the presidency, our party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, is giving critical support to Bernie Sanders and telling people, if you're a Democrat, vote for Bernie Sanders in the primaries. It's an essential fight against the establishment.
Thank you so much for your time, Gloria. We've been speaking to Gloria La Riva. She's a longtime labor union activist, an anti-war activist, a friend to Cuba and Venezuela, and she's now running for the Party of Socialism and Liberation.